We've created already a running project in DBT where we've seen how to create several models, both tables and views on top of our sources, how to use the macros, change variables, and also packages to make our development easier and more modular. We are now going to complete our project with testing and documentation. Testing and documentation is not needed. We've seen already how we can run models and how it impacts our data warehouse, but it's very much suggested to have a mature project. Let's start with a test. A test is an assumption that we make about our data. So something that a behavior that our data should have. In DBT, a test is the same as a model, a select query. This means that we're going to run a DBT test, and it's going to compile to a SQL query that it's going to return the amount of failing records. So what it's going to try to do is query how many records do not follow the assumption that we made about our data. If there are any records as a result of this query, then it's going to tell us how many in the terminal as the result of running our test. Like here, we can see that there was a warning in this test, and there are 3 results that are not following the assumptions that we made about this data. The tests are being defined in the YAML file under the column name. And DBT is going to provide us 4 basic tests that we could add to our columns to check if those values are unique, not null, within accepted values, or a foreign key to another table. Here we can see how they're defined in the YAML file. Here is the column name. Here you can see a description that we're going to see later for the documentation. And under test, you can see the tests that are linked to this column. And in this one, for example, in the column trip ID, there are 2 tests, unique and not null. And here we can see how after running the test, from the target folder, I can show the compile code for the not null test. If you see here, it's actually checking that the trip ID is null, which means it's always checking against the actual assumption. And if this gives me a result, then the test has failed. If it doesn't give me a result, it means nothing is null, the test has passed. The same we've seen with the macros. If you can create a query for your assumption, then you can create your custom test. Or you could also use packages and import them and use tests that are pre-made. DBT utils that we use, for example, for the macros before, they have a variety of tests that you could try to use in your project. And as I said here, there's a description as well linked to the column. And that's because DBT also provides a way to generate documentation for the whole project. And we could render this as a website as well. We've seen already how to document the columns, but you could also document the model. And DBT knows this, whatever you write in the YAML, so the descriptions, the test as well. We've also defined the sources in the YAML file. And with that, with the code from your models, plus the compile code, with the ref macros that we've used as well, and the auto-generated DAG, it's going to render all of this in a website that it's going to look like this. And it's also going to add some information that it's going to retrieve from your data warehouse. This website can be embedded in DBT Cloud, or if you're running in the terminal, so DBT locally, you could also run DBT docs generate and DBT docs serve, and you could have it as well in your local host. Let's now go back to our project. We're going to see from DBT Cloud. I've created already the DM monthly zone revenue that I've copied from the finished repo. Just have in mind here that one of the fields is commented out that it has different syntaxes for Postgres object query, so adapted to the one that you're using. And now I'm going to the schema.yml under the staging folder. We had originally defined this part, and in the YAML file, the mandatory part that we always have to add are the sources. Otherwise, DBT wouldn't know how to resolve the location of those sources. But we could also add another section for our models. In this sense, without this section, DBT would still run, as we've seen, but it's not mandatory, but it's encouraged to do. Here, I already just copy-pasted from the finished repo, and we're going to see what it's here. First, the definition of the name of a model. Under that, there's description. If it's a short description, you can just write it here. Otherwise, you can just use the symbol and write a whole paragraph. Under columns, you can define as many columns as you want to document. I've defined documentation for all of the columns from the documentation from the original site where we use the data from. And I defined several tests. So for trip ID, I've defined the test unique and not null, both with severity 1. And the severity, what it's going to do is it's going to define if once this test is running in the terminal, if it fails, should DBT still keep running everything else or should it stop entirely? A warning will mean that at the end, it's going to show us in the terminal the warning, but it's going to run everything. And never is going to mean that it's going to stop immediately from running the other models. Another test that we've seen is the pickup location ID, that it's using the relationship test and also the drop-off location. And what it's going to check is that the pickup location and the drop-off location, they exist in the taxi zone lookup in the field location ID. And the last test that we are going to see is the accepted values under payment type. And in here, I actually use a variable. And that's because these accepted values are going to be applied to both green and yellow trip data. They both have the same field payment type with the same accepted values, which means that if in a month from now we want to add another accepted value because there's suddenly a new payment type, I'm going to come here to the schema YML and have to modify it in both places. Right now, this is only green and yellow trip data, but imagine if you were to have much more, then using a variable can be very convenient. And how do we define this variable? In the project YML. And here, note also that I use quote false. This is because by default, we're going to see from the project YML, it's going to take those accepted values as chars. So let's go here to the project YML, and where we've defined the seeds, we're going to add another section for the variables, and we're going to just add the name of the variable that we want to use, payment type values. And here we define something like we would define a list in Python. And we know that the accepted values are something between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. What I mentioned before about the quote is that this, in the test, once it compiles, it would translate to varchar. So it would like show something like this. And since we know the accepted values is an integer, then we don't want to do that. We want to use it as it is. So let's save this. And let's now run dbt test. So I can do dbt test, and then I can filter by a model, and then it would run all of the tests that are linked to one single model. I could select a test in particular if I know the name. We're going to see the names of the tests once they run. Or I could also do dbt build, and that would run everything that I have in my project. So it would run the seeds, it would run the test, and it would run the models. We're going to just do dbt test and run all of them. And here we can see already two have given us a warning, and the others have passed. And here you can see the names of the test. So if you see, it kind of like combines the name of the test, the name of the model, and the name of the field. So all of this, they have passed. And if we want to go to the unique, I know already that this has given me a warning, and this one as well. And this is because we've made an assumption on this trip ID that we created as a primary key, and we even defined in the documentation that this is a primary key, but this was actually not unique. So this is why it's so important to define tests that make those assumptions about the behavior of our data, so then we can actually model correctly. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to go to both green and trip data, and I'm going to copy and paste the part of the model that I'm missing. So basically what I'm going to do is just std here on top, and I'm going to deduplicate this data. And this is normally how you would go about test. So you either would go back to your models, and this part is not there. You either would go back to your models and modify them because your assumption is true, but your modeling was not true. On your source data, you took everything when you should have like maybe filter, like we are doing here with the vendor is not null, or the duplication. We're going to take the row number equal 1, and we're going to do the same with the yellow trip data. Or you would just have to modify the test. That would be the second part. So you either modify your model because you're not filtering your data correctly, or you modify your test because the assumption is not correct. I am not going to build everything. I'm going to run DBT build, and this is going to run absolutely everything we've created so far. So hopefully everything goes on green. If you see, I already have everything passed, and I already have the staging models, the macro, the seed, sorry, the test on top of the models, the staging models, and then I have the other models, and lastly this. So if you think a little bit about the DAG that we saw, this goes more or less in that order because it knows our dependencies, so then it knows what to run first. And regarding the threads, for example, in this one, these three, they're not related. So then the threads are going to be running this in parallel, but then it's going to have to finish this one, for example, to be able to run fact trips. There was another one, another file for documentation that we're missing, but after this, we have completed the project entirely. So I'm just going to copy paste the schema OML here and the schema OML under the seeds and the macros. You can also document macros and seeds as well, because those are part of your project. And this completes the whole project.